The distress call came on a cold winter morning in the year 2347. It traveled through the darkness of space for many years before reaching the deep space relay station that floated in orbit around Neptune. Lieutenant Morgan was working her usual night shift when her console started blinking with an alert she had never seen before. The signal was weak and broken, but it was clearly not random noise. Something or someone was sending a message. Called her supervisor, and within an hour the entire station was awake and working. The message was in a language no human had ever heard. It took the translation computers 3 days to decode enough of it to understand the basics. When they finally understood what it said, felt her heart sink. A species called the Were dying. An empire known as the Dominion was hunting them across the stars and killing them world by world. They had sent their cry for help in every direction, hoping that someone would hear them, hoping that someone would care. The message was sent to Earth immediately. Within a week it had reached the United Earth Defense Council, the governing body that controlled all military matters for humanity. Admiral Ben Harper was among the first to read the full translation. He was an old man with gray hair and tired eyes, but those eyes grew sharp as he studied the data that came with the message. The had included everything they knew about the Dominion: battle records, ship specifications, a list of the 200 species that had already conquered or destroyed. Admiral Harper spent 3 days studying that information. He barely slept. He barely ate. His aide, Commander Lisa Grant, brought him coffee and watched him work with growing concern. She had served under Harper for 12 years and she had never seen him like this. When he finally looked up from his screens, his face was pale but his voice was steady. "Call an emergency session of the Council," he said. "I know what we need to do." The Council chamber was the largest room on Earth's orbital headquarters. 200 representatives from every nation sat in curved rows facing a central platform. Admiral Harper stood alone on that platform, surrounded by holographic displays showing star maps and battle projections. Councilor Maria Santos, the chairwoman, opened the session with a simple question. "Admiral Harper, you requested this meeting. What do you propose?" Harper took a deep breath. "They are asking for humanitarian aid, medical supplies, refugee transport, maybe some defensive weapons. That is what they expect from us, but I have studied the Dominion carefully. I have learned how they fight. I have learned how they think. And I believe that if we send humanitarian aid, we will be sending those supplies to a dead species that will be gone before our ships arrive." The chamber was silent. Harper continued. "They do not negotiate. They do not accept surrender. They do not stop until every last member of a resisting species is dead. They have 3 months at best. If we want to save them, we cannot send charity. We must send our fleet, all of it. We must go to war." The chamber erupted. Representatives shouted over each other. Some called Harper a madman. Others demanded to know how humanity could possibly fight an empire that had been waging war for thousands of years. They had conquered 200 species. Humanity had only achieved faster than light travel 60 years ago. It was impossible. It was suicide. Admiral Harper waited for the noise to die down. Then he nodded to Commander Grant, who activated a new set of displays. Images filled the chamber. Burned worlds. Shattered fleets. The records they kept of their conquests, broadcast across the galaxy as a warning to anyone who might think of resisting. "These are the species who did not fight," Harper said quietly. "They conquered them anyway. They were peaceful. They were advanced. They thought they could avoid war by avoiding conflict. They were wrong." He changed the display to show a map of the galaxy. A red stain marked territory, spreading outward like a disease. "In 200 years they will reach human space, maybe sooner. We can wait here and build our defenses and hope that we are strong enough when they come, or we can choose when and where to fight. We can meet them now, while they are far from their core worlds. We can meet them while we have allies who know their tactics and their weaknesses." Councilor Santos leaned forward. You are asking us to send our entire military across 400 light years to fight a war for a species we have never met. The casualties could be catastrophic. We could lose everything." Harper nodded. "Yes, we could, but I have studied them carefully. They are powerful, but they are not invincible. They win because no one has ever truly fought back. Every species they have faced has tried to defend their worlds and wait for rescue that never came. No one has ever attacked them. No one has ever taken the war to their territory. They have no doctrine for facing an enemy like that. They have no experience with an enemy who is willing to die to win." He paused and looked around the chamber at all the faces watching him. "Humanity has been fighting wars since before we could write. We have thousands of years of military history. We have tactics and strategies that no species in this galaxy has ever seen. They think they know war. They don't. They know slaughter. They know conquest. But they have never faced a people who answer a call for help by bringing everything they have." Commander Grant spoke for the first time. "They are not asking us to fight for them. They don't even know we exist yet. They sent a message into the darkness hoping for anything at all. A few ships, some medicine, any sign that they are not alone. Imagine what it would mean to them if instead of a few supply ships, they see an entire fleet. Imagine what it would mean to the galaxy." The debate lasted for 8 hours. Representatives argued and shouted and threatened to walk out. Admirals presented casualty projections that made strong men weep. Scientists explained just how far 400 light years really was and how long it would take to get there. Economists calculated the cost of mobilizing the entire human military. But in the end, when the vote was called, the answer was yes. Morgan was still on duty at Neptune Station when she received the news. She read the message 3 times to make sure she understood it. Humanity was going to war, not to defend themselves, not to conquer territory, but because someone out there in the darkness had asked for help. She looked out the window at the stars that suddenly seemed less empty than before. Somewhere out there, a dying species was still fighting. They did not know it yet, but help was coming, and it was bringing more than they had ever dared to imagine. 6 weeks after the council vote, the largest fleet humanity had ever assembled gathered in the cold darkness at the edge of the solar system. 312 warships floated in perfect formation among the icy rocks of the cloud. There were small and fast destroyers built for speed. There were heavy cruisers carrying enough firepower to crack a moon. There were carriers filled with hundreds of fighter craft. And at the center of it all was the massive dreadnought Constellation, the flagship of Admiral Ben Harper. Captain Danny stood on the flight deck of the carrier Freedom's Call and looked out at his pilots. They were young, most of them. Some had never seen real combat, but they had trained for this moment their entire lives, even if they never knew exactly what that moment would look like. Danny was not a man who gave long speeches. He believed in simple words that meant something. "They asked for help," he said. "We're going to give them more than they ever imagined." The pilots cheered. It was not a loud cheer or a long one. It was the sound of people who understood what was coming and had made peace with it. Danny nodded once and walked back to his quarters to review the jump coordinates one more time. The journey took 11 days through compressed space. The ships traveled faster than light, bending the fabric of reality around them in ways that still made physicists argue. Inside the ships, the crew prepared for what was coming. They checked weapons systems and ran combat drills. They wrote letters home that might never be delivered. They prayed to gods they were not sure existed. And they waited. When the fleet emerged at the edge of territory, they found exactly what Admiral Harper had predicted: death. The first thing they saw was debris, pieces of stations and ships and things that might have once been cities floating in the void. Scorch marks on asteroids where battles had been fought and lost, a graveyard that stretched across millions of kilometers. Commander Lisa Grant stood beside Admiral Harper on the bridge of the Constellation and felt her stomach turn. She had studied the reports. She had seen the numbers, but seeing it in person was different. This was what defeat looked like. This was what happened when you lost. Sir, the sensor officer called out. I'm detecting ships, small group, 15 vessels heading away from us at low speed. Harper studied the display. The ships were clearly not. Their design matched the specifications they had included in their distress call. 7 of them were warships, badly damaged and barely functional. The other 8 were civilian transports, packed with refugees. Hail them, Harper ordered. The communication took several minutes to establish. They had never spoken with humans before, and their translation systems had to work hard to make sense of the signal. When the image finally appeared on the screen, Harper saw a being unlike anything he had ever encountered. Tall and slender, with iridescent skin that shifted colors as it moved. 4 arms folded nervously across its chest. Eyes that were large and dark and filled with something Harper recognized immediately. Fear. I am, the being said through the translator, commander of what remains of the Fifth Fleet. You are the ones who answered our call. Harper nodded. I am Admiral Ben Harper of the United Earth Defense Fleet. We received your distress signal. We have come to help. Skin rippled with colors that had no translation. He looked past Harper at the tactical display showing the human fleet, and his 4 arms trembled. You brought warships, he said slowly. So many warships. We asked for medicine, for supplies, for transport to take our refugees somewhere safe. We did not expect this. We know what you asked for, Harper said, but we know what you need. You need someone willing to fight. That is why we are here. The first meeting happened aboard the flagship, which had once been a proud vessel, but was now held together with emergency repairs and desperate hope. Colonel Amy led the human delegation. She was a Marine commander, tough and practical, with short dark hair and eyes that missed nothing. She had fought in 3 wars and buried too many friends to count, but she had never met an alien before. Greeted her in a chamber that might have once been beautiful. The walls were cracked now and the lights flickered. Others watched from the shadows, their skin colors muted in shades that would later learn meant grief. I must understand, said. Your species has chosen to go to war with the Dominion for us, for strangers you have never met. Why would you do this? Thought about the question. She thought about all the answers she could give, politics, strategy, self-interest. All of those things were true in their own way, but they were not the real answer. Because you asked, she said simply. That is what humans do. When someone asks for help, we answer. But you do not know us. We have nothing to offer you. We are a dying people with nothing left but broken ships and frightened children. The Dominion has taken everything from us. Why would you risk your lives for that? Smiled, though it was not a happy smile. You still have hope. I can see it in the way you keep fighting even when fighting seems pointless. That is worth saving. Skin flickered through a dozen colors in rapid succession. The translator could not interpret the emotion, but understood anyway. It was the look of someone who had given up and suddenly found a reason to believe again. Over the next 3 days, the human and commanders worked together. They shared information about the enemy. They planned their first moves. They were shocked by the human approach to warfare. They had always fought defensively, trying to protect their worlds and their people. The idea of attacking first, of taking the war to the enemy, was strange to them. Admiral Harper explained human military history, the great battles, the famous tactics, the way humans had learned through thousands of years of fighting each other that sometimes the best defense was a devastating offense. Listened with growing wonder. Your species fights itself, he asked. We did, Harper admitted. For a very long time. We only stopped a few centuries ago, but we never forgot how. Colors shifted again, this time to something bright and fierce that the translator called determination. Then perhaps, he said slowly, the Dominion is about to learn something new. The Dominion had ruled this part of the galaxy for 3,000 years. They were a proud species, tall and powerful, with thick gray skin that could stop a blade and eyes that saw in spectrums most species could not imagine. They had built their empire through conquest and maintained it through fear. Every species they encountered faced the same choice: submit completely or be destroyed completely. There was no middle ground. There was no negotiation. Overlord commanded the fleet blockading Prime. He was old by standards, having served the Dominion for over 200 years. He had personally overseen the destruction of 17 species. He kept trophies from each conquest in his quarters aboard the dreadnought Eternal Dominion. He was not cruel by nature, but he was thorough. The Dominion demanded nothing less. When his scouts reported detecting unknown vessels in the outer system, felt something he had not experienced in decades: curiosity. The ships did not match any known design. Their energy signatures were strange, and there were a lot of them. "Find out who they are," he ordered. "Send a patrol. If they are here to help, destroy them." 12 warships jumped to intercept what appeared to be a single enemy vessel near the third moon of the outer gas giant. The ship was smaller than their cruisers, clearly some kind of light combat vessel. Standard doctrine was simple: surround the target, demand surrender, destroy it when surrender was refused. Captain Jack watched the patrol approach on his tactical display. He was commander of the destroyer Resolute, and he had been waiting for this moment for days. His orders from Admiral Harper were simple: make contact with the enemy, learn how they fight, and do not die. "All hands prepare for combat," announced calmly. "Execute Maneuver Alpha on my mark." They surrounded the Resolute in a perfect sphere, cutting off all escape routes. Their commander broadcast a demand for surrender in a language the human translators could barely understand. The tone was arrogant, bored even. This was routine for them. Smiled grimly, "Mark." The Resolute fired its engines at full power and dove toward the nearest gap in the formation. The enemy ships moved to intercept, exactly as Harper had predicted. Led them on a chase through an asteroid field, weaving between rocks and debris with skill that came from years of training. They followed, confident in their numbers. They never saw the ambush coming. 24 human ships had been waiting in complete silence among the asteroids. Their engines were cold. Their systems were dark. Their crews had been breathing recycled air in pitch blackness for 18 hours, waiting for this moment. Once Resolute flew past their hiding spots, they came alive. The battle lasted 6 minutes. They had never faced an enemy that used ambush tactics on this scale. Their formation scattered as missiles came from every direction. Their shields, designed to handle frontal assaults, could not cope with attacks from multiple angles at once. 11 ships were destroyed before they could organize a response. The 12th was crippled and captured. Human losses were 0. Commander Nick Torres led the assault from his frigate, the Hawkins. When the fighting was over, he surveyed the wreckage with quiet satisfaction. It was a small victory, but it proved something important. They could be beaten. Back on the Eternal Dominion, Overlord received the report with something his species expressed as fury. A deep rumbling sound that made the deck plates vibrate and the crew step back in fear. He had lost patrols before, of course, but never like this. Never so quickly, never so completely, and never to a species no one had ever heard of. "Find them," he ordered. "I want 30 ships hunting these creatures. Find them and destroy them all." The 30 ships found the human fleet at the gas giant 7. Or rather, the humans found them. Torres had positioned his strike force in the magnetic shadow of the giant planet, invisible to sensors. When the enemy patrol passed by, searching for targets, Torres struck. This battle was longer. They had more ships and they were ready for tricks, but they were not ready for human tactics. Torres split his force into 3 groups that attacked from different directions, forcing the enemy to divide their attention. When they turned to face one group, another would strike from behind. When they tried to retreat and regroup, human ships cut off their escape routes. They fought bravely. They were warriors by nature and they did not surrender. But bravery alone could not overcome an enemy who seemed to know exactly what they would do before they did it. Human commanders had spent thousands of years learning how to predict and manipulate enemy movements. They had spent thousands of years fighting enemies who simply tried to survive. 22 ships were destroyed. 8 escaped with heavy damage. Torres lost 3 ships and 412 crew members. He recorded each name personally and sent the list back to Admiral Harper. Every death mattered. Every sacrifice would be remembered. Overlord studied the reports from the surviving ships with growing unease. These new creatures did not fight like any species he had encountered. They did not defend. They attacked. They did not react. They anticipated. They used tricks and traps that seemed almost dishonorable to warriors, but dishonor meant nothing when you were dead. He called for reinforcements. 50 more ships would arrive within the week. He also sent a report to the Dominion High Command, describing this new enemy and requesting information. The response came back empty. No one had ever encountered this species before. No one knew where they came from or what they wanted. For the first time in his long career, felt something unfamiliar. It took him several minutes to identify the emotion, because he had not experienced it since he was a young warrior facing his first battle. It was fear. He pushed the feeling aside and focused on the tactical situation. The blockade of Prime was still intact. 90 ships surrounded the planet, slowly bombarding the surface and killing millions. That was what mattered. These new creatures were annoying, but they could not challenge the full might of the Dominion fleet. He was wrong. He would discover just how wrong in the days to come. But for now, he waited and watched and tried to understand an enemy unlike any the Dominion had ever faced. Admiral Harper received Tor's report aboard the Constellation. He read the casualty list twice, memorizing the names. Then he looked at the tactical data and allowed himself a small smile. They were exactly what he had expected: powerful, disciplined, predictable. "Begin Phase 2, he ordered. "It's time to take the war to them." The siege of Prime had lasted 9 months. Below the blockade, 6 billion civilians huddled in underground shelters while bombs fell on their cities above. The beautiful towers that had once reached toward the sky were ruins now. The oceans that had covered most of the planet were poisoned with radiation. Every day, thousands more died from starvation, disease, or the endless bombardment. They had stopped counting their dead. There were too many. Overlord had received his reinforcements. 140 warships now held orbit around the dying world. More were coming from the core systems, but was confident he did not need them. These strange new creatures had won a few small victories through tricks and ambushes, but they could not possibly challenge his fleet directly. No species had ever been foolish enough to try. Admiral Harper looked at the tactical display aboard the Constellation and made his choice. His staff had argued for waiting. More ships were available if they delayed a few weeks. The odds would improve, but Harper knew something they did not. Every day they waited meant more dead. The math was simple, even if the numbers were terrible. "We go now," he said. "All ships, every weapon we have." The human fleet jumped to Prime at dawn local time. They emerged from compressed space in 4 separate formations, each with a specific mission. Captain Jack commanded 60 ships tasked with engaging the main fleet directly. Colonel Amy led the marine transports that would attempt to land on the planet's surface. Commander Nick Torres took his strike force to hunt the enemy command ship. And Admiral Harper held a reserve force, waiting for the moment when everything went wrong. In war, something always went wrong. Ships appeared almost on top of the formation, so close that their shields nearly touched. His gunners had been ordered to fire the moment they exited compressed space, and they did. The first volley caught the enemy completely by surprise. 3 cruisers exploded before they could raise their shields. Roared orders from the bridge of the Eternal Dominion. His ships scrambled to respond, but the humans gave them no time to organize. Pushed his fleet straight into the heart of the enemy formation, accepting terrible damage in exchange for the chaos it caused. They could not coordinate their fire without risking hitting each other. Their numerical advantage meant nothing when they could not use it. Transports ran for the planet. 24 ships carrying 15,000 Marines raced through the battle, trying to reach atmosphere before they could stop them. Enemy destroyers broke off to intercept. Missiles filled the space around the transports. Watched 8 of her ships die in the first 3 minutes, torn apart by weapons that left nothing but dust. "Keep going," she ordered grimly. "We stop for nothing." 16 transports reached atmosphere. 8 more were destroyed on the way down, tumbling through the clouds in flames. Landed with 6,000 Marines instead of 15,000, but she landed. Her boots hit the scorched ground of a world she had never seen before, and she immediately began organizing her forces. They had been watching from their shelters. They had seen the battle in orbit through what remained of their sensor networks. They could not believe what they were seeing. Someone was attacking someone was actually fighting back. When human Marines appeared outside Shelter Complex 7, the largest civilian refuge on the planet, the resistance fighters emerged to meet them. Found herself facing a being much like, with the same iridescent skin and 4 arms. This one was female, named, and she commanded what remained of the planetary defense forces. 3,000 fighters armed with weapons they had stolen from dead soldiers. "You came," said through the translator. Her voice was strange, as if she could not quite believe the words she was speaking. "You actually came." "We're here," replied, "and we're not leaving until this is over. Can you fight?" "We have been fighting for 9 months. We are tired. We are starving. We have lost everything." Paused, and her skin shifted to that fierce, bright color the humans had learned to recognize. "Yes, we can fight." Together, human Marines and resistance fighters established a defensive perimeter around Shelter Complex 7. 2 million civilians depended on them now. Set her people to work building fortifications and preparing for the counterattack she knew was coming. In orbit, the battle raged on. Tors found the Eternal Dominion at the center of the formation, a massive dreadnought that dwarfed every other ship in the system. His 17 frigates and destroyers looked like insects next to it, but Tors had spent days studying the enemy ship's design, and he had found something interesting. A weakness in the shield geometry around the engine section. A gap that appeared for just a few seconds when the ship changed course. "All ships follow my lead," Tors broadcast. "We're going to kill that thing or die trying." They attacked in a spiral pattern that forced the Eternal Dominion to constantly adjust its heading. Each time it turned, the shield gap appeared. Each time it appeared, human ships poured fire into it. The gunners tried to destroy the attackers, but Tors kept his ships moving too fast to target effectively. It was a dance of death that lasted 40 minutes. On the bridge of the Eternal Dominion, Overlord watched his shields failing and felt that unfamiliar emotion again. Fear. These creatures were not supposed to be able to do this. No one attacked a Dominion dreadnought directly. No one was that foolish. No one was that brave. The reactor breach started small. A crack in the containment field. A surge of energy that the emergency systems could not handle. Had time to understand what was happening. He had time to feel something like respect for the enemy who had beaten him. Then the Eternal Dominion exploded, taking him and his crew into the darkness. Without their command ship, the fleet fell into confusion. Different captains gave conflicting orders. Some tried to retreat. Others tried to continue the attack. None of them could coordinate effectively. Admiral Harper saw the chaos on his tactical display and committed his reserve force at exactly the right moment. The battle turned. By nightfall on Prime, the blockade was broken. 63 ships were destroyed. 47 fled into compressed space, running for the safety of Dominion territory. 30 were captured or crippled. Human losses were terrible. 87 ships destroyed. 23,000 dead. Tors survived, though the Hawkins was barely functional. Lived, though half his crew did not. held the ground on the planet's surface, protecting 2 million civilians through a night of counterattacks that cost her another 1,000 Marines. But when the sun rose over Prime, it rose on a free world for the first time in 9 months. Admiral Harper sent a simple message to the survivors. The blockade is broken. You are free. In Shelter Complex 7, 2 million emerged into daylight they had thought they would never see again. They looked up at the sky and saw human ships instead of bombers. They saw Colonel's Marines standing guard around their home. They saw Hope. Stood beside and watched her people weep with joy. Her colors shifted through emotions that had no human translation. "Why?" she asked quietly. "You lost so many. 23,000 of your people died for us. Why would you pay such a price for strangers?" Thought about the question. She thought about all the friends she had buried that day. She thought about the letters she would have to write to their families. "Because that's what we do," she said finally. "When someone needs help, we help, even if it costs us everything." The war did not end at Prime. It had only begun. For 3 years, human and ships fought side by side across 100 star systems. The Dominion had ruled the galaxy for 3,000 years, but they had never faced anything like this alliance. The humans brought tactics and weapons, and a willingness to fight that shocked their enemies. They brought knowledge of territory and a burning desire for justice. Together, they pushed the Dominion back world by world. News of the liberation of Prime spread across the galaxy like fire. Species that had been conquered generations ago heard that someone had finally stood up to the resistance. Movements that had almost given up found new hope. And slowly, carefully, other species began to join the fight. They were the first. They had been slaves to the Dominion for 500 years, forced to work in mines and factories that fueled the war machine. When human ships appeared in their system, they rose up against their masters. 2 million died in the uprising, but when it was over, they were free. Their leader, an old worker named Tor, pledged his people to the alliance. "You showed us that the Dominion can bleed," he told Admiral Harper through the translator. "We never knew that before. We thought they were gods. Now we know they are just conquerors, and conquerors can fall." They fought back with everything they had. They brought their greatest fleets from the core worlds. They unleashed weapons that had not been used in 1,000 years. They offered peace treaties that would have given them time to rebuild. The alliance refused every offer. There could be no peace with an empire built on the bones of 200 species. There could only be victory or death. Admiral Harper led the campaign for 2 years. He was everywhere at once, it seemed, planning battles, inspiring troops, making the hard choices that no one else wanted to make. He grew thinner and grayer as the war continued, but his eyes never lost their fire. He had begun this fight with a single speech before the United Earth Defense Council. He intended to finish it. The final campaign began in the 3rd year. The Alliance had pushed the Dominion back to their home territory. Prime, the world where their empire had been born, was within reach, but it was also the most heavily defended planet in the galaxy. 300 warships guarded it. Millions of soldiers waited on the surface. They knew that if they lost there, everything would collapse. Harper assembled the largest fleet the Alliance had ever gathered. Human ships, ships, ships. A dozen other species who had joined the fight, each with their own reasons for hating the Dominion. Together, they represented the greatest military force in galactic history, and they were still outnumbered. The Battle of Prime lasted 3 days. On the first day, the Alliance fleet engaged the outer defenses. Commander Nick Torres led the vanguard, his rebuilt flagship Hawkins at the front of the formation. He had lost friends at Prime. He had buried more friends in the battles since. He fought now with a quiet fury that his crew had learned to recognize. The outer defense stations fell one by one. On the second day, the main fleets clashed. Captain Danny launched his fighters from the Freedom's Call and led them into the heart of the formation. He had trained these pilots himself. He had watched them grow from nervous recruits into hardened warriors. Now he watched them die, one by one, as they tore holes in the enemy line. Survived, though his fighter was barely functional when he finally returned to the carrier. Half his pilots did not come back. On the third day, Admiral Harper committed everything. The reserve forces, the damaged ships that could barely fly, every weapon that could still fire. The Alliance pushed toward Prime with nothing held back. Harper led from the front, aboard the Constellation. He had done this throughout the war, despite the protests of his staff. He believed that a commander should share the risks of those he commanded. When a missile struck the Constellation's bridge, he was standing exactly where he had always stood. Commander Lisa Grant was thrown across the deck by the explosion. When she looked up, she saw Admiral Harper lying against the shattered remains of his command chair. He was still alive, but barely. Blood covered his uniform. His breathing was shallow. "Sir," she whispered, crawling toward him. Harper opened his eyes. They were still sharp even now. "The battle," he managed to say. "Status." Grant checked the tactical display. Through the smoke and chaos, she could see that the line was breaking. The enemy flagship was burning. Their fleet was scattering. "We're winning, sir. We did it." Harper smiled. It was a tired smile, the smile of a man who had given everything he had. "Tell them," he said quietly. "Tell them we came because they asked. Tell them that's what humanity does." Those were his last words. The war ended 3 weeks later. Without their greatest fleets, the Dominion collapsed. Some factions surrendered. Others fled to distant corners of the galaxy. The empire that had ruled for 3,000 years was gone. Lieutenant Morgan stood in the Great Hall on Prime where the peace treaty would be signed. She had been promoted many times since that cold morning when she first heard the distress call. Now she was Captain Morgan, commander of the diplomatic vessel that had carried representatives from every allied species to this moment. The hall was filled with beings of every shape and color, humans in their dress uniforms, with their shifting chromatic skin, with their heavy frames and hands. A dozen other species, each with their own story of suffering and liberation. They had come together because one species had answered a call for help. Stood at the podium. He was old now, aged by war and grief, but his voice was strong as he addressed the assembly. "We sent a message into the darkness," he said. "We asked for help. We hoped for mercy. We prayed for salvation. We expected perhaps a few ships, some supplies, any sign that we were not alone in a cold and uncaring universe." His colors shifted through that emotion that still had no human translation. Instead, humanity gave us something we had never imagined. They did not send charity. They did not send advisors. They sent their sons and daughters to die for strangers. They answered our desperate call with absolute war. They showed us that in all the vastness of space, there is a species that hears cries for help and answers not with what is easy, but with everything they have. He paused, looking out at the assembly. "Today, we sign a treaty that creates a new alliance. The Galactic Alliance, they are calling it. A union of free peoples, bound together by shared sacrifice. But we should never forget how it began. It began because humanity does not ignore those who ask for help. It began because when the darkness seemed absolute, one species chose to bring light." Captain Morgan stood at attention as the flags of 100 worlds were raised together for the first time. Beside her stood Commander Lisa Grant, now an admiral herself. She had taken command of the fleet after Harper's death and led them to final victory. Her eyes were wet, but her back was straight. On the other side stood Colonel Amy, who had held the line at Prime and never stopped fighting. And next to her was Private Sam, one of the Marines who had survived that terrible landing. He was missing an arm now, lost in a battle on a world whose name he could not pronounce. He did not care. He had helped save a galaxy. Through the great window of the treaty hall, human and ships flew in formation. They cast shadows across the rebuilt towers of a world that had nearly died, a world that now represented hope for the entire galaxy. Captain Morgan thought about Admiral Harper. She thought about the 23,000 humans who had died at Prime. She thought about all the others who had fallen in the 3 years since. They had answered a call for help. They had paid the highest price, and because of them, the galaxy would never be the same. The darkness was not gone. It would never be completely gone, but now there was light to push it back. Now there was an alliance of free peoples who would stand together against any threat. Now there was hope. Humanity had answered a desperate call with absolute war, and in doing so, they had given the galaxy something it had never known before. A future.